Scano, Swigo, Jeff Doctor, Nigio. So hi, I'm Jeff Doctor. I'm a Cayuga Nation citizen from Six Nations of the Grand River. Yesterday I talked about AI and all that fun stuff on a panel. And today I'll give I'm not going to go into a long kind of like briefing or technical overview of what this particular bill is. Instead, I think I'm going to give you all some homework. So I'm going to ask a whole bunch of fun questions. So first of all, who actually knows anything about Bill C2, the Strong Borders Act? I'm seeing a little bit here. Like y'all have probably heard, okay? A couple people in the room have put their hands up. Who here's heard about Bill C5? Can't even remember the actual long title of that one. Building Canada? I don't think they're Build Canada again. What could possibly go wrong? Okay, so I'm in a strange space between Indigenous activism and being a nerd, working in tech, coming to things like this. And I find that right now there's this strange kind of overlap that I see very clearly between a lot of these bills that Canada is forcing through right now. So Bill C5, that is at the federal level. So this is a Canada-wide legislation that it was like the first thing that Carney did was just basically just did all sorts of shenanigans. I don't understand the Canadian parliamentary system super well. I don't really care. I'm Haudenosaunee. It's not my business. But basically, he rammed through this bill. And that bill is very much about ostensibly making it easier to build things, easier to remove environmental regulations, easier to remove labor regulations, easier to basically make it easier for capital to have more security to invest in major projects. Carney comes from a banking world. He is very much about moving capital from one pile to another to make that pile get bigger. That's what he does. At the same time, this other bill he's also proposing, and Bill C2 ostensibly is about stronger borders. And of course, as a Haudenosaunee person, like I don't recognize the Canadian border. I don't care about it. Like we exist as Haudenosaunee on both sides of that imaginary line, and we'll move back and forth across whatever colonizer says. Now that said, there's still border guards, and there's still laws that colonizers like to try to enforce. So coming back to where we're at with the internet, kept hearing a lot yesterday about like not sure what words to use, but like increasing connectivity. As people gain more access to the internet, especially if they didn't necessarily grow up with it, they haven't seen the growing pains of what it's like to grow up with the internet for the last 10, 20 years. I don't know how old I am now. There's a lot of risks that come with it because the way the internet works is that as you do stuff, the service providers, the data providers, like basically as you move stuff through the internet, if it's not encrypted, meaning that if it's not basically like locked in a little magical technical box, somebody can see it as it's moving through the internet, or somebody can see it as it's stored. So this begs the question, who is that somebody? So what Canada wants to propose through Bill C2 is what can often be called like lawful access provisions, meaning that it gives this very broad definition of the Canadian security state, police, spies, CSIS, all these 4 or 3-letter agencies, the ability to basically request data politely from service providers. Well, who's the service provider? Is this your ISP or is this your hairdresser? When asked about it, Canada's like, it's kind of both. And it's like, wait, what? So now police can basically call up your hairdresser and be like, yeah, I need to see everyone who's got their haircut for the last 4 years. And if you don't give me those records, I'm going to fine you. Whoa, that seems intrusive. So this begs a really interesting question about the internet. And there's folks here in this room that are very, working on this problem. What does that mean for the internet when the Canadian governments, under the auspices of quote unquote national security, are introducing vulnerabilities into the internet, when they're reducing the ability to have your data encrypted, moving through, the internet pipes, and then safe where they're stored so that no one can see it. And so what does it mean when we can't necessarily trust that the internet is serving us? And that's just a regular person. That's not necessarily somebody that is resisting the state for whatever reason, which is a talk I just did earlier today. So for Indigenous folks who are already vulnerable under colonization, what does it mean when the thing that is wonderful about the internet, the ability for us to communicate in private in ways that Canada might not necessarily like? What does that mean when that's undermined? What does it mean when things that are pitched to make you safe, but who watches the watchers? Who basically determines, one, what is safe, what is legal, what is appropriate, and two, who watches them? So as Indigenous peoples, obviously, we get real nervous when Canada starts pushing through more ostensibly oppressive laws, especially under the auspices of keeping you safe. They're not necessarily specifying who. So again, I don't have like a long time to get into all the specific details of this very large bill. There's bits about immigration. There's bits about the border, that's what it's called. Like there's all sorts of things like that, but there's two major sections in the theme of this conference, 14 and 15, that I highly recommend checking out. And just reading the actual, like what it says. And it's very intrusive in terms of providing police access to what should be private data, you would assume. The Canadian Constitution, I would assume, would say that's private data, but they're still trying to force it through. And so, yeah, right now there's an open letter from the Global Encryption Alliance that I recommend checking out. And in terms of just like regular digital privacy, I also recommend, especially if you're engaging in any activities that you think the state might not like at some point, you might want to start thinking about your own digital security. And what I mean by that is we can't take for granted the civil liberties that we have right now are always going to be with us. That's pretty obvious in terms of what's happening, just south of the imaginary line, where what was legal one day is no longer legal. But what happens when there's a record of you engaging in a certain activity that one day was legal and the next day is now not legal? What happens when the state that just created that law to make that new activity or that old activity illegal now has a record of it and can access that relatively simply? So knowing that this is recorded and broadcast online, I'm not going to go into too much details about what should be done about this, but just going to give you a bit of a wink and a nod about that. So Nyawa, and thanks for listening.